Hello, everybody. I would say that the place that Moby Dick occupies in American literature is roughly similar to the place that War and Peace occupies in Russian literature. It is, in so many ways, the pinnacle of our 19th century literary tradition. Its loftiest and best remembered achievement. It also has a reputation for being really hard and long to read. So I suspect many of you are going to hate me at least just a little bit for having you read this thing right before your exams and summer break. But to those of you who are up to the challenge, you will at minimum earn bragging rights. But this also just happens to be one of my very favorite books. And if you will give it time to get acquainted with it, to dig into it, then I suspect that many of you will find it enjoyable as well. So the reason we're reading it at all, not to mention reading it as the capstone for this course, is because Moby Dick contains within it almost all of the romantic themes that we have discussed during this semester. It's a book about leaving your routine life behind in order to seek adventure on the forbidden seas and barbarous coasts, as Ishmael says. It is a book about humans contending with nature and with their God. It is a book that celebrates multi-ethnic democracy in the style of in the style of Whitman, and expresses fascination with native peoples in the context of empire. And embedded within its adventure story is a critique of Enlightenment empiricism and rationalism. But because this is a very deep book with a very unconventional structure and a lot of embedded symbolism, I'm going to use this lecture to kind of prepare you for what's to come. Okay, so coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about the plot without spoiling it. We're going to talk about its contribution to Romanticism, a little about its characters, and the structure and narrative style. So, the plot of the novel is pretty simple, okay? It can be summarized within just a few sentences. Okay, we have the protagonist, Ishmael, who decides that it is time for him to seek his fortune on a whaling vessel, and along with his new friend, Queequeg, who you also met in this reading, signs on for a 3-year voyage on the Pequod, which is led by the one-legged Captain Ahab. Um, as you're going to see in the reading for later in the week, early in the voyage, the crew is told of Ahab's true aim, which is to hunt down and kill the fabled white sperm whale, Moby Dick, who took Ahab's leg in an earlier encounter. So, on the surface, a whale hunt is to gather natural resources, to gather whale oil and other things that can be used as commodities. But Ahab also has this separate purpose, which is to get revenge on the whale that took his leg. So, on their journey, the crew does encounter many whales. We get lots of scenes of whale hunting and whale chases, and they also encounter other whaling vessels. And in the process, we, the readers, are treated to some very detailed explanations of the workings of a whaling ship and increasingly philosophical meditations about the meaning of the white whale. Okay, so that is the basic plot. Again, without giving away the ending here. So, along with Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville is considered to be one of the great representatives of dark romanticism in the American tradition. So, despite Ishmael's kind of humorous, light, kind of sunny, occasionally disposition, his early philosophizing about the mystical nature of water, this is not really a book about contemplatively finding enlightenment on the ocean. Okay, rather, this is about a brutal life and death struggle between human beings and their environment, and about one man's vendetta against a particular whale, which comes to symbolize like the whole contingency of human existence, the subjectness of human beings to fate, and also just the terrible, merciless majesty of nature itself. It's in its more philosophical moments that Moby Dick makes its signature contributions to Romantic epistemology. Remember back from early in the semester where we talked about epistemology as the study of knowledge, of how we know things. And the basic question it asks is, how do humans know what we know? And in order to try and answer it, it presents us with a kind of case study of a whale. How do we know what a whale is? Um, Even before the beginning of the book, Melville appeals to different disciplines in order to try to make sense of what humans have known about whales and what whales have meant to them. This is why we start with that rather eccentric double preface. the first of which is devoted to etymology, compiled by a late consumptive usher, and the second of which is the extracts of the sub-librarian, in which like almost every single reference to whales or things that might be whales in Western literature is brought together, beginning with Genesis, like the beginning of the world, and taking us all the way up through like classical poetry. Okay, so making this book a kind of compendium of all human knowledge about whales up to 1851, when it was published, the book attempts to show how all the methods of studying the whale arrive at best, only a partial glimpse of what it is and what it means. The more we know, it suggests, the more we realize what we don't know. And this is why this sub-librarian character introduced to us at the head of the extracts is kind of forlorn. He's a painstaking burrower and grubworm of a poor devil of a sub-sub. Um, and, uh, and, and and we're also told that regardless of what we find here, we should not take any of these higgledy-piggledy whale statements, however authentic, in these extracts for veritable gospel cetology. So we have this kind of figure of a long-suffering scholar, a guy who's been working his entire life to gather all of these references to whales throughout Western literature. But in the end, it amounts to not very much. Like, even though they're authentic, we can't take them as authoritative. They can't really encompass all that a whale is. And this guy's work is doomed to some extent by subjectivity and partiality. So, in other words, this is a book that probably better than any other work of fiction articulates Romanticism's critique of Enlightenment epistemology, and what would ultimately become the critique of epistemological foundations. So go back and revisit the lecture and discussion of Emerson and William James if you want help remembering what all of that is about, because those ideas are being brought back in this book. Okay, so that's kind of the big idea. Let's talk now for a second about the characters. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the two principal characters here, Ishmael and Captain Ahab. So many of the characters in the novel, as you may have noticed, are given names with a kind of symbolic or religious significance. And that begins first and foremost with the protagonist. So he tells us, "Call me Ishmael," in one of the most famous opening lines in all of Western literature, which informs us not that Ishmael is the character's name, but that it is what he wants us to call him. So the story of Ishmael comes from the Hebrew Torah and the Quran. He's a major figure in both texts. He was one of the sons of Abraham. And in the Genesis narrative, Abraham was promised by God that he would be the father of a great nation. However, Abraham's first wife, Sarah, was old when this promise was made and had not yet born a child. And the two of them receiving this promise from God kind of were like, well, what the heck is God talking about? How can we have children? You know, Sarah is past the age of childbearing. And so they said, aha, we have a solution. Sarah gave Abraham her servant named Hagar, who Abraham took as his second wife. And Hagar became pregnant. And at that point, she and Sarah began to quarrel. Sarah began to get jealous of her for getting to be ostensibly the mother of this great nation that was promised. And she drives Hagar away, and Hagar flees out to the desert. She stops at an oasis, and there she encounters an angel of God who tells her that she is going to give birth to a son whose name will be Ishmael, and that she should return to Sarah and submit to her, because God promises that he is going to take care of Hagar and Ishmael. Abraham and Sarah would ultimately have a son named Isaac, who would become the father of the Hebrew nation. So the story of Hagar and Ishmael is usually interpreted as one in which Abraham and Sarah, having doubted that God's promise would ever be fulfilled, lost faith and attempted to take matters into their own hands by having Abraham marry Hagar. So, in other words, it's a story about humans attempting to force the hand of fate rather than trusting God to fulfill his promises. And as such, Isaac, who is the son of Abraham and Sarah, is the chosen one, the one through whom God would fulfill his promise, because Isaac was the son who was promised. However, insofar as Hagar and Ishmael were innocent parties in all of this, God made promise to bless them as well, saying that he would make Ishmael a great nation too, but also that he would be a wild donkey of a man, and that he would come into conflict with everyone he met. So Ishmael, according to the legend, would become the father of the Arab nation. So, thus, in taking the name Ishmael, the protagonist of Moby Dick is taking on the mantle of the son who is simultaneously blessed and cursed, not the chosen son, and the son who does not fit into society, but nevertheless, who was also set on earth in order to fulfill a great purpose. Okay? Um, Ahab, on the other hand, um, is one of the biblical kings of Israel. Or he's the name of one of the biblical kings of Israel. And he is known as kind of the wicked king. He is the king who abandoned Yahweh in order to worship the pagan gods of his wife Jezebel. If you haven't heard of Ahab, you have probably heard of Jezebel, or at least heard references to Jezebel as kind of the type of a seductress or even a witch. Ahab is definitively a villain in the Bible. He is one of the most evil characters in the entire Old Testament, such that, as Ishmael will say in an upcoming chapter, when he died, his blood was lapped up by dogs, which was a symbol of his cursedness in the eyes of God. However, as another character will say, Captain Ahab did not name himself, suggesting that for Captain Ahab, this name signifies both his wickedness and also his struggle against fate. He is doomed, in some sense, to be who he is. He has an evil name that dooms him to be this guy who is fated to chase this white whale across the globe, bringing great catastrophe in the process, but in some ways he cannot help it. He's in a struggle against his fate. Captain Ahab is also just one of the most memorable figures in all of American literature and has often been compared to the Greek anti-hero Prometheus, as well as to Milton's Satan and to Shakespeare's King Lear. So again, we have this return of the type of the satanic hero or the satanic anti-hero or even the Byronic hero here. So there are some other names with biblical resonance, including Elijah, who was the prophet who contended with King Ahab, and the captains Bildad and Peleg, who are the owners of the Pequod. But these are minor characters, and if you want to dig around and see if you can tease out some thematic resonance there, then go right ahead. But I'll just say before moving on that the name of the Pequod itself is historically significant. The Pequot Indians were another Algonquin tribe, like the Mohicans, that were decimated and scattered during the period of European colonization in New England. The point here is, of course, that Melville tends to choose names that kind of suggest a coming doom, foreshadowing, again, without spoiling, some of the catastrophic results of this kind of mad chase after Moby Dick. The name Moby Dick, on the other hand, it's not a biblical or literary reference, but it's actually based on a real albino whale called Mocha Dick. And he was killed apparently near the island of Mocha. So that's why he is called Mocha Dick. And Melville learned about this whale from an article published in 1839. There actually were lots of real life sources of inspiration, including Melville's own experiences on a whaling ship. But I'm actually going to save those for a future lecture where I think the context will be a little bit more important once we actually get into the story of the whaling voyage. So, another thing that you should know is that Melville frequently plays around with different genres and narrative styles in this book in ways that kind of anticipate the narrative techniques of modernist and postmodernist writers. So, there are a few different types of chapters, and critics have tried to kind of categorize them. And in general, we have the following types of chapters. So, what we've been spending most of our time in so far is the main narrative. Okay, so this is just Ishmael's first person account of his journey. That's where we have been really so far. Once we get out on the water, however, there is going to be a series of what are called 9 gams. And a gam is actually a word for a meeting of whales, but it's used figuratively in the book in order to suggest a meeting between whaling ships. So the Pequod is going to meet 9 ships that all have reports of seeing Moby Dick, that have all encountered Moby Dick. Okay, and each meeting has, again, a kind of symbolism or a kind of thematic importance, and we're going to talk about those as they come. But that's one thing you should prepare yourself for is the 9 gams. Pay special attention to the meetings with the other whaling ships. There are also scenes of actual encounters with whales, so like either seeing whales, or there are also some whale chases. So that's kind of the action part of the book, the most exciting part. But those also are all designed to kind of teach us something about whaling and also about the book's overall philosophy. And then finally, there are the cetology chapters, and these are the chapters that students tend to resent the most, and wonder why it is that they're there. These are the chapters that contain really detailed information about whales and about whaling. Okay, and so it can seem like a lot of unnecessary added information, but again, when we get to them, we'll talk about why it is they're there and what it is that Melville is doing with them. But just so you know, there's a purpose for them when you do encounter them. There are also some chapters that contain sermons. You read that chapter for today. There are some chapters that are constructed like Elizabethan plays. Shakespeare was actually a major source of inspiration for Melville, and Moby Dick has a lot of references to King Lear and to Macbeth. Again, we'll talk about what those mean when we get to them, but just so you're prepared, there is some playing with genre, some playing with narrative style. Okay, so that's essentially what I would like you to know, what I think you need to know going into this book. The rest I am going to leave for us to work out in our upcoming discussions. Again, if you have questions about anything in the reading that I don't address in my lectures or in the proposed discussion questions, please remember that you are always invited to ask questions of your own in the online forum. Again, this book is going to be a challenge. It's more challenging than most of the stuff that we have read so far. And so it's expected that there are going to be things that are a little bit mysterious, on a first reading. So please let me know, and I'll make sure that we address the points that give you guys the most trouble, or things that you find are the most interesting.